All right, let's jump right into this explainer on one of the most highly romanticized and, let's be honest, fundamentally chaotic 200-year periods in human history. The Crusades are so often painted as these simple, heroic tales of knights and castles. But the reality? It's way more complex. We're looking at a massive saga of shifting empires, desperate survival, and some truly profound cultural exchange that totally rewire the medieval world. Picture the scene. It's July 15th, 1099. An exhausted army finally breaches the massive, fortified walls of Jerusalem. But to even get to the singular moment, these first crusaders had to march over 2,000 grueling miles, literally walking all the way from Western Europe straight into the Middle East. And when they finally broke through those gates, all that pent-up exhaustion and trauma unleashed a brutally indiscriminate massacre of everyone inside the city. And that horrifying climax brilliantly captures the intense religious fervor of the whole era. The slaughter was carried out under a terrifyingly simple justification. You've probably heard the famous battle cry, Deus vult, God wills it. That single phrase acted as a spark, launching a violent back-and-forth battle for survival between East and West that would relentlessly rage on for centuries. To make sense of all this centuries-long warfare, shifting empires, and wild alliances, we'll track this pendulum of power across 5 main chapters. We've got the spark of Holy War, conquest of the Holy Land, the rise of Saladin, how the Crusades lose their way, and finally, the final collapse. So Chapter 1, the spark of Holy War. We're starting with a massive geopolitical tinderbox right in the middle of a deeply fractured 11th century Mediterranean world. The fuse for this tinderbox is essentially lit by the rapid, aggressive expansion of the Seljuk Turks. They migrate out of Central Asia and just sweep in, capturing Baghdad in 1055. Then, in 1071, they deal an absolutely catastrophic blow to the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, staring down the very real threat of total collapse. The weakened Orthodox Byzantine Emperor Alexius I makes a desperate plea in 1095. He asks his Catholic neighbors in the West for military backup, and Pope Urban II seizes the opportunity. But here is a super fascinating financial reality. Getting an expedition of up to 100,000 people off the ground is expensive. So participating knights actually pledged their feudal estates to monasteries in exchange for upfront cash. In Old French, this arrangement was called a mortgage, literally translating to a death pledge. Basically, if you died on crusade, you forfeited your land. So yeah, financing this massive medieval holy war literally gave us the modern concept of the mortgage. Crazy, right? Now, before those official, heavily armed knights even packed their bags, a terrifying wave of absolute chaos struck. A highly charismatic preacher named Peter the Hermit whipped up a vast, totally disorganized mob of peasants and just headed east. This so-called People's Crusade tragically showed how unchecked the momentum of this holy war really was. They massacred Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland before crossing into Anatolia, where, frankly, they were promptly and predictably annihilated by the Seljuks at Sivitwin in 1096. Which brings us to Chapter 2, Conquest of the Holy Land and Establishing Outtrim. Because when the official crusading knights finally showed up, they radically altered the map. After fighting their way all across Anatolia and surviving a brutal 7-month siege at Antioch, the Crusaders finally reached their main objective. But the army standing outside Jerusalem was just a fraction of its original size. We're talking only about 12,000 exhausted fighting men left. Still, after a grueling 5-week siege, they breached the walls in July 1099. As we mentioned earlier, they massacred the inhabitants, claiming the city for Christianity for the first time in over 400 years. To try and hold on to this victory, the Crusaders set up a string of feudal states along a narrow coastal strip. This area became known collectively as Outre-mer, which just means overseas in Old French. Now, surviving out there was incredibly precarious. They were surrounded by vastly larger Muslim powers and cut off from Europe by thousands of miles of ocean. To protect these vulnerable frontiers, they birthed massive, fiercely wealthy military orders. The famous Knights Templar and the Hospitallers, just to garrison their castles. Keeping this territory alive required some serious logistics. Thanks to Italian maritime republics like Venice and Genoa, those military supply lines quickly evolved into a hugely lucrative two-way trade. But here's the absolute crucial takeaway. Along with moving luxury goods like silk and spices, this trade network transmitted forgotten, highly advanced scientific expertise, stuff like medicine, math, and astronomy, from the Islamic world directly back into Christian Europe. It literally sparked a major intellectual revival. Moving right along to Chapter 3, The Rise of Saladin. This is the Islamic counter-offensive, where we see that pendulum of power dramatically swing back the other way. You see, a massive strategic mismatch was quickly emerging. Outremer was just this set of narrow, highly fragmented coastal strips. Compare that to what popped up by 1174, the Ayyubid Sultanate. Under the command of a brilliant, highly tactical Kurdish general named Saladin, Egypt and Syria were completely unified. For the first time in nearly a century, those Crusader states woke up to find themselves completely boxed in by a single, formidable Islamic powerhouse. And Saladin expertly played this advantage. In 1187, he lured the Crusader army out into the sweltering desert at the Horns of Hattin and just decisively crushed them. A mere 3 months later, Jerusalem fell. Interestingly enough, Saladin notably chose to spare the lives of the city's inhabitants, a stark contrast to 1099. But for Europe, the loss of Jerusalem sent utter shockwaves through the continent, instantly prompting monarchs to launch the Third Crusade. And this Third Crusade? It's a famously star-studded, yet ultimately totally compromised campaign. First, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa marches this massive German army east, only to tragically drown in a river, which causes most of his guys to just turn around and go home. Then you've got Richard the Lionheart and Philip II. They managed to capture Acre, securing some vital coastal territory, but they simply don't have the manpower left to take back the Holy City itself. Ultimately, the 1192 Treaty of Jaffa leaves Jerusalem firmly in Muslim hands. Okay, Chapter 4, The Crusades Lose Their Way. Let's look at the detours and disasters, because these subsequent campaigns completely morph from focused holy wars into bizarre and, frankly, tragic political side quests. Which brings up a really baffling puzzle. Why on earth would a crusade attack a Christian city? It makes no sense, right? Well, the Fourth Crusade in 1202 is the perfect example of how those original religious motivations became entirely hijacked by financial desperation and regional politics. Here is exactly how that tragic chain of events went down. The Crusaders assemble in Venice, but whoops, they are vastly short on funds to pay for the ships they already contracted. So the Venetians demand the Crusaders sack the Christian port of Zara just to clear the debt. Almost immediately after, a disinherited Byzantine prince swoops in, offering to fund their entire holy war if they just install him on the throne in Constantinople. They agree, but, shocker, his extravagant promises fail, and the desperate Crusaders and Venetians end up violently sacking Constantinople in 1204, utterly devastating the greatest city in Christendom. And then there is the wild anomaly of the Sixth Crusade. Get this, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II had actually been excommunicated by the Pope, but he was deeply fascinated by Islamic science and was totally fluent in Arabic. So, instead of choosing warfare, he simply opened up diplomatic negotiations with the Ayyubid Sultan, and in 1229, he successfully secured Jerusalem through a treaty. No bloodshed. He literally achieved through deep personal interest and diplomacy what massive armies had failed to do for decades. Now for our final chapter, Chapter 5, The Final Collapse. The Mamluk Sweep. This is where new, massive superpowers arrive from the east to extinguish the Crusader presence permanently. A massive geopolitical shift out east essentially sealed their fate. First, the Mongols violently sweep out of Asia, sacking Baghdad and causing this immense wave of displacement. This displacement inadvertently pushes a band of Turk mercenaries right into the Holy Land, where they sack Jerusalem in 1244. But that seemingly unstoppable Mongol advance? It's finally halted in 1260 by the Mamluks. These guys were formidable former slave soldiers who overthrew their masters to seize absolute power in Egypt. They defeated the Mongols and then systematically turned their crosshairs on the remaining Crusader states, taking them out one by one. The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. In the spring of 1291, Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived outside the massive Crusader stronghold of Acre with an army of 60,000 men. After a relentless 6-week siege, they fought the Crusaders down to the absolute last man. With the fall of Acre, almost 200 years of Western presence in the Holy Land was completely and permanently extinguished. In the highly fragmented aftermath of those 2 centuries, the original goals of the Crusades essentially just dissolved. Those great military orders we talked about, they were forced to relocate to islands like Cyprus.
Back home, European leaders totally lost their appetite for unified holy war, and increasingly just turned to fighting domestic squabbles amongst themselves. The once mighty Byzantine Empire was left a permanently weakened shadow of its former self, while a brand new Islamic power, the Ottomans, began their steady rise.
And the great historical irony here is just profound. As the Ottoman Empire rises to trigger a near mirror image conflict that would last for another 400 years, we have to ask ourselves, did the Crusades achieve anything other than an endless pendulum of holy war? It is a super provocative thought, and exactly what you should take away from this explainer today. This violent two-century experiment didn't resolve the geopolitical tensions of the Mediterranean at all. It merely reset the stage for centuries of future conflict.